They had hosted hundreds of exchange students from across the galaxy, species of every shape and intelligence level, and every single one followed the same pattern: arrive nervous, overcompensate with formality, and quietly accept their place in the hierarchy. But when the human from Australia walked through the docking corridor, late, unbothered, and carrying a battered travel bag covered in faded warning stickers, the station's welcome committee immediately felt something was off. Not because he looked dangerous, but because he didn't look impressed at all. His eyes casually scanning military-grade bulkheads like they were mildly interesting architecture. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he didn't recognize fear as something worth rehearsing. And when an alien official cleared their throat and announced the station's strict behavioral protocols, the human simply nodded, smiled, and said, "Yeah, no worries," a phrase that would later be translated into 17 different languages as a potential threat. Because within hours of his arrival, assumptions would shatter, safety systems would fail, and a room full of advanced alien species would realize far too late that they hadn't invited a fragile observer. They had imported a walking stress test from one of the most hostile environments in known space. And if you enjoy stories like this where small misunderstandings spiral into unforgettable consequences, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know what you think the aliens are about to get wrong. Because this story is just getting started, and they're already regretting it. The Heliox academic ring had been constructed not merely as a place of learning, but as a statement, a vast orbital structure suspended above a gas giant, whose violent storms served as a constant visual reminder of nature subdued by intelligence. And every species that entered its docking bays understood immediately that they were guests inside something older, smarter, and far less forgiving than themselves, which was precisely why the arrival of the human exchange student registered as such a quiet anomaly. Because instead of pausing at the threshold to absorb the scale of the station, instead of hesitating beneath the towering archways etched with diplomatic insignia and security warnings, the young human stepped off the transport ramp mid-conversation, with himself rolling his shoulders as if stiff from a long flight, tugging at the strap of a scuffed travel bag that bore the marks of extensive use rather than ceremonial preparation, and glancing around with an expression that suggested mild interest rather than awe. His name appeared on the reception display as Liam Carter, species, human, origin, Earth, Australian continent, status, civilian exchange student, and the line beneath it, translated automatically for all present, read average by species standards, which reassured the welcoming committee more than it probably should have, because humans were still categorized as a developing species, technologically inventive but biologically unremarkable, emotionally volatile yet physically limited, and therefore suitable candidates for cultural exchange rather than strategic concern. The lead xenocultural officer, a tall avian-featured being whose kind valued precision above all else, began the formal greeting protocol with practiced elegance, outlining the station's hierarchy, behavioral expectations, and emergency procedures, in a tone designed to command respect. Yet as the words echoed through the reception chamber, it became increasingly clear that the human was not reacting as anticipated, not because he was confused or defiant, but because he simply did not seem intimidated, his gaze drifting from speaker to speaker, occasionally settling on architectural details or passing drones, once even tilting upward to watch a maintenance platform glide along the ceiling rails, prompting him to mutter a soft, "Impressed, that's clever," under his breath. When the officer reached the section regarding restricted zones and potential hazards, emphasizing the importance of compliance for personal safety, Liam nodded along politely, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, posture loose, weight shifted onto one leg, like someone listening to instructions he fully intended to follow, but did not consider life-altering. And when asked directly whether he understood the regulations, he responded not with a formal acknowledgement, but with an easy smile and the phrase, "Yeah, mate, sounds fair enough," which caused a brief flicker of uncertainty among the observers. As the translation matrix hesitated before rendering the response, as compliance confirmed with informal confidence, the moment passed without comment. Yet small irregularities continued to stack quietly as Liam reached out instinctively to steady a drifting service drone that veered too close to his head, touching alien technology without hesitation, without fear, without asking permission, a gesture that should have triggered a warning response, but instead resulted only in a recalculation of several internal threat assessments, because humans were supposed to approach unknown machinery with caution, not casual familiarity. As the delegation escorted him deeper into the station, past security checkpoints and observation galleries where other exchange students waited nervously, Liam asked practical questions about sleeping arrangements, meal schedules, and weather. The station had anywhere decent to get a workout, none of which aligned with the expected priorities of a species entering a multi-civilizational environment for the first time. And when one official attempted to clarify that physical exertion facilities were optional and regulated, Liam chuckled softly and said he'd go spare without one, a statement logged as humorous comment despite the subtle tightening of concern among the analytical staff. By the time they reached the residential wing, no alarms had sounded and no protocols had been violated. Yet an unspoken tension lingered in the air, not because the human had done anything overtly wrong, but because he moved through the heliox ring as if it were a place he belonged, not a structure meant to dwarf and humble him. And as he disappeared into his assigned quarters, whistling a tune that none of the translation systems could identify, the station's oversight AI flagged his file for passive observation, noting with algorithmic neutrality that the human exchange student exhibited an unusual lack of stress. Indicators for his circumstances, a trait that, while not inherently dangerous, often preceded unexpected outcomes in environments that relied on predictability to maintain control. By the time Liam Carter finished unpacking his belongings inside the residential module assigned to him, the Heliox academic ring had already begun doing what it did best whenever an unfamiliar variable entered its ecosystem, observing, categorizing, and quietly attempting to predict outcomes. His quarters, designed to accommodate a wide range of species, were far more spacious than what most exchange students received, largely because human physiology was still poorly understood by the station's planners, and Liam noticed this immediately, commenting aloud that the place was pretty roomy for student housing, before tossing his bag onto the sleeping platform and rolling his shoulders again as if shaking off gravity rather than travel fatigue. Unbeknownst to him, the room's ambient sensors were recording everything from his resting heart rate to the way his muscles responded when he stretched. And while none of the readings were alarming on their own, the pattern they formed was unusual, showing a baseline of calm that barely shifted even as the room's environmental system subtly adjusted temperature, pressure, and lighting to test his adaptability. Meanwhile, several levels above, a small group of xenocultural analysts gathered around a translucent display, reviewing his intake footage and behavioral data with mild interest rather than concern, discussing him the way one might discuss an oddly-shaped puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the expected frame, but wasn't obviously disruptive either. Their consensus, at least for the moment, was that the human was socially informal to a fault, possibly overconfident due to ignorance of galactic norms, and therefore likely to correct his behavior once the novelty wore off and the reality of his surroundings fully set in, a theory supported by centuries of data showing that most new arrivals experienced a delayed stress response after their first rest cycle. That assumption began to weaken almost immediately when merged from his quarters ahead of schedule, already changed into casual exercise clothing, and asked the corridor attendant for directions to the nearest physical training area, a HFY request that prompted a brief pause as the attendant cross-referenced his clearance and species profile, ultimately guiding him toward a shared recreational zone, used primarily by high-gravity species whose musculature required constant conditioning. As Liam walked, he took in the station with open curiosity, nodding politely at passing students, offering a friendly hey to a trio of insectoid researchers who froze mid-conversation at being addressed so casually, and stopping once to peer through a viewport at the gas giant below, its swirling storms reminding him faintly of satellite images he'd seen of Earth's own cyclones, only bigger and angrier. When he reached the training area, he found it nearly empty save for a few alien students engaged in slow, deliberate movements that suggested controlled strength rather than explosive power, and after a moment of observation, he selected a free space, set down his water container, and began a warm-up routine that drew more attention than he realized, not because it was flashy, but because it was efficient, fluid, and unmistakably practiced. The observers monitoring the feed noted with growing curiosity how naturally he adapted to the station's gravity, compensating instinctively for micro-variations that most off-worlders struggled with for days. And when he increased the resistance on a multi-species strength apparatus beyond what was recommended for humans, several automated warnings appeared on nearby consoles, only to be dismissed when Liam completed the movement without strain and reset the machine with a satisfied nod. Elsewhere on the station, word of the human's behavior began to spread informally among the exchange cohort, filtered through layers of interpretation and exaggeration, until by the time Liam returned to his quarters to prepare for his first academic session, he had already acquired a reputation as the relaxed one, or, less kindly, the oblivious one, a label that followed him into the introductory seminar hall where representatives of multiple species gathered to outline the goals of the exchange program. The hall itself was designed to equalize presence, with tiered seating and adjustable lighting meant to prevent any one species from dominating the space. Yet as Liam took his seat, stretching his legs out comfortably and glancing around with interest, several attendees found their attention drawn to him despite themselves, unsettled by the fact that he appeared more at ease here than they did. The session began with formal addresses and carefully worded statements about cooperation, mutual understanding, and the value of shared knowledge, all of which Liam listened to attentively enough, though his focus sharpened noticeably whenever practical applications were mentioned, and when the floor was open for questions, he raised his hand without hesitation, asking how emergency authority was delegated in the event of a multi-system failure, a question that caused a brief ripple. Authority was delegated in the event of a multi-system failure, a question that caused a brief ripple of surprise among the facilitators, who had expected inquiries about housing or dietary compatibility, not crisis response. The answer, delivered cautiously, emphasized centralized command and strict adherence to protocol, and Liam nodded thoughtfully, murmuring, "Right. So stick to the plan unless the plan's cooked," a phrase that once again tested the limits of the translation matrix and earned him a mix of puzzled stares and uneasy glances. As the session concluded and students filtered out, the station's oversight AI updated Liam Carter's profile once more, flagging a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. The human did not merely tolerate unfamiliar environments. He seemed to assess them instinctively, mapping risks and contingencies without conscious effort, a trait that, while still within acceptable parameters, nudged his classification from average by species standards to behavioral variance noted. It was a small change, buried deep within layers of data that few organic minds ever reviewed, but it marked the first official acknowledgement that the human exchange student was not reacting to the Heliox academic ring the way the ring expected. And as night cycle settled over the station and most of its inhabitants retreated to rest, Liam lay back on his sleeping platform, hands folded behind his head, staring at the softly glowing ceiling and thinking not about how overwhelming the day had been, but about how oddly familiar it all felt, unaware that the systems watching him had begun, ever so quietly, to reconsider what they thought they knew about humans. The following cycle began with what the Heliox academic ring designated as a low-intensity integration module, a carefully structured academic exercise intended to ease new arrivals into cooperative problem-solving without exposing them to stressors that might provoke instinctive or culturally ingrained responses. And it was precisely this classification that would later be cited as the station's first major miscalculation. The session took place in a modular simulation chamber whose walls could reconfigure to mimic a wide range of environmental and logistical scenarios. And as the mixed species cohort assembled, the facilitators explained that the objective was simple: assess a hypothetical system's failure and collaboratively determine the most efficient resolution using shared expertise rather than individual initiative. Liam arrived a few minutes early, coffee-like beverage and hand-approved substitute, nutritionally optimized, and took a seat near the middle, listening as the parameters were outlined with an attentiveness that suggested genuine interest rather than obligation. According to the scenario, a remote research outpost had lost partial power following a micrometeor impact. Communications were degraded but not severed, and several non-essential systems were offline, creating a situation that required calm analysis, delegation, and adherence to established repair hierarchies, all of which aligned neatly with Heliox's philosophical approach to crisis management. When the simulation activated and the holographic environment shimmered into place, depicting a damaged control hub surrounded by warning indicators and fluctuating energy readouts, the group fell into an expected pattern with senior students from long-established spacefaring species assuming leadership roles, assigning tasks and debating procedural order while others waited for direction. Liam, for his part, observed quietly at first, eyes moving constantly, not just between the projected data strings, but across the room itself, noting how participants positioned themselves, how long it took certain species to respond to alerts, and which warnings were being ignored in favor of more visibly dramatic problems. As the discussion grew increasingly detailed, focusing on whether the communications array should be stabilized before rerouting power to life support redundancies, Liam leaned forward slightly and asked, in a tone that was neither confrontational nor dismissive, whether anyone had checked the station's structural integrity readouts, a question that caused a momentary pause as several participants scanned the displayed data, realizing that while the impact itself had been addressed, secondary stress fractures had not been fully modeled. The facilitators exchanged a glance, subtly pleased at the humans' engagement. But before the conversation could fully pivot, one of the leading alien students waved the concern aside, citing protocol that prioritized system hierarchy over speculative damage, and Liam shrugged, leaned back again, apparently content to let the process continue. It was only when the simulation escalated unexpectedly, an event scripted into the module to test adaptability, that the room's dynamics shifted, as a cascade failure caused several warning indicators to spike simultaneously, triggering automated alerts and narrowing the window for effective response. Voices overlapped, protocols conflicted, and the carefully balanced hierarchy faltered as participants hesitated, each waiting for confirmation before acting. And in that brief hesitation, Liam stood up, moving with a decisiveness that cut through the noise as he crossed the room to the central console, pointing out that the simulated outpost's atmosphere processors were drawing power from a compromised conduit and would fail within minutes if not isolated. The facilitators were about to intervene, to remind him of the exercise's collaborative constraints, when he added, almost as an afterthought, That isolating the conduit would also stabilize the stress fractures he'd mentioned earlier, buying time for everything else to be fixed properly. The room went quiet, not because Liam had raised his voice or issued a command, but because his solution was correct, efficient, and delivered without any trace of urgency or ego, as if he were pointing at an obvious oversight rather than correcting a room full of advanced beings. When the facilitators confirmed the outcome and allowed the simulation to continue along the adjusted parameters, the scenario resolved cleanly, earning a success rating higher than the cohort average. And as the environment faded back into the neutral tones of the chamber, several participants turned to look at the human with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild irritation. Liam, seemingly oblivious to the attention, returned to his seat and took another sip of his drink, commenting that the setup reminded him a bit of a storm-damaged field station he'd studied back home, a comparison that meant little to most of the room, but caused the oversight at AI to flag the reference for later review. In the post-session analysis, the facilitators praised the group's overall performance while noting, with diplomatic restraint, that unsanctioned initiative could be disruptive if not properly integrated into established command structures. A remark clearly aimed at Liam, who accepted it with an apologetic smile and a nod, saying he'd try not to jump the gun next time, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that waiting would have improved the outcome. As the cohort dispersed, the station's internal networks buzzed quietly with discussion. Informal messages passing between students who were reassessing their first impressions of the human exchange student, no longer dismissing him as merely relaxed or oblivious, but uncertain how to categorize someone who could dismantle a carefully constructed hierarchy without ever challenging it directly. The oversight AI updated his profile again, this time adding a more significant notation regarding adaptive problem-solving under pressure, cross-referencing it with historical data from other human interactions that have been deemed statistical outliers rather than representative samples, and for the first time, a low-level alert was generated recommending that human behavioral norms be re-evaluated in light of emerging patterns. Liam, unaware of any of this, spent the remainder of the cycle attending lectures, chatting easily with anyone who would engage him, and later returning to the training area for another workout, humming softly as he pushed himself just a bit harder than before, while far above in the quiet logic cores of the Heliox ring. Systems designed to predict and prevent instability began to consider the uncomfortable possibility that the human exchange student was not an anomaly at all, but a preview of something the galaxy had profoundly underestimated. If the previous integration module had unsettled the Heliox academic ring's expectations, the fourth cycle ensured that the unease would no longer be confined to academic curiosity, because it marked the first time the human exchange student was exposed to an unscripted variable, one that no facilitator had planned and no protocol had anticipated unfolding in quite the way it did. The day began ordinarily enough, with Liam attending a comparative engineering lecture focused on redundancy systems across different civilizations, a topic that drew steady engagement from him as he listened, occasionally jotting down notes, and asking questions that leaned less toward theory and more toward practical failure points. But midway through the session, a subtle tremor rippled through the station, barely perceptible to most species, yet instantly noticed by the structural sensors embedded throughout the ring. Alarms did not sound, and the instructor continued uninterrupted, attributing the fluctuation to routine orbital adjustments. But Liam paused, pen hovering over his tablet, brow furrowing slightly as his eyes flicked upward, an unconscious reaction logged by the observation systems as a reflexive response to environmental change. Minutes later, a second tremor followed, stronger than the first, causing several light panels to flicker and prompting a brief hesitation in the lecture before automated reassurances appear on the room's displays. declaring all systems stable and advising occupants to remain calm. Most complied without question, accustomed to trusting the station's near-perfect safety record. Yet Liam shifted in his seat, scanning the room and the data overlays with a focus that suggested he was correlating information rather than accepting it at face value, and when the instructor attempted to resume, he raised his hand, asking whether the ring had recently adjusted its orbital distance from the gas giant below, a question that drew a ripple of surprise and a slightly defensive response that such details were managed by autonomous systems far beyond the scope of the class. What happened next unfolded quickly enough that later analysis would struggle to pinpoint the exact moment when routine became crisis, as a localized power fluctuation caused a section of the ring's inner support lattice to lose synchronization, triggering a chain reaction of minor system faults that, while not immediately dangerous, created a level of unpredictability the Heliox ring had not experienced in decades. Corridor lighting dimmed briefly in several sectors. Gravity fluctuated by a fractional margin that went unnoticed by most, but caused unsecured objects to shift, and a handful of environmental controls reset themselves into default modes, all of which were promptly flagged and addressed by automated subsystems that worked tirelessly to contain the disturbance. In the lecture hall, the instructor received a silent update assuring them that the issue was under control, and evacuation was deemed unnecessary. Yet as the class was dismissed and students began filing out, a sudden sharper jolt rocked the corridor outside, sending one of the heavier participants stumbling and causing a maintenance panel to tear loose from the wall, exposing a tangle of sparking conduits. Panic did not erupt, but confusion did, as several species froze in place, instinctively waiting for instructions that had not yet been issued, while warning glyphs flashed intermittently, offering contradictory guidance as different subsystems attempted to assert priority. It was in this moment of hesitation that Liam reacted, not with dramatic heroics, but with the same practical decisiveness he had shown in the simulation, moving toward the fallen panel without raising his voice, instructing nearby students to clear back and stay low, his tone calm enough that they obeyed without thinking about why. He assessed the exposed conduits with a quick glance, identifying the source of the sparks and the unstable oscillation in the gravity field that was causing the panel to vibrate dangerously. And while the station's protocols would have required him to wait for a certified technician or security unit, Liam instead used the weight of his body to brace the panel, adjusting his stance instinctively to compensate for the fluctuating gravity, and reached into his pocket for a compact multi-tool he carried out of habit rather than necessity. With careful, deliberate movements, he severed a secondary power line to stop the feedback loop, then used the tool to manually secure the panel just enough to prevent further movement, all while automated warnings scrolled across the nearest display, urging unauthorized personnel to disengage. The entire sequence lasted less than a minute, and when the station's emergency response team arrived moments later, they found the situation stabilized and the human exchange student stepping back, wiping his hands on his jacket and apologizing for jumping in without clearance, a phrase that did little to mask the astonishment spreading among the responders as they reviewed the data and confirmed that his intervention had prevented a more serious failure. The incident was logged, of course, flagged for procedural review and potential disciplinary action, but as the ring's oversight AI cross-referenced the event with his previous actions, a more troubling pattern emerged, one that suggested the human did not simply react well under pressure, but perceived danger earlier than most species and acted within that window without hesitation. In the hours that followed, rumors spread quickly through the exchange cohort, embellished and distorted as such stories always were, transforming a practical act of problem-solving into something closer to legend, with some claiming the human had ignored station warnings entirely and others insisting he had physically held the structure together through sheer strength. Neither of which was true, yet both of which hinted at a growing shift in perception. Official statements framed the incident as a minor systems fault resolved through combined efforts, and Liam himself downplayed the event when questioned, insisting that anyone could have done the same and that he'd just been closest. But the ring's internal analytics told a different story, highlighting his ability to function effectively in a moment when others froze, not because they were incapable, but because they had been conditioned to wait for certainty. As night cycles settled in and the station systems returned to their flawless hum, the Oversight AI issued a quiet advisory to senior staff, recommending that human behavioral responses be studied more closely in unscripted environments, a suggestion that carried more weight than any of the organic minds involved yet fully grasped, because it acknowledged, perhaps for the first time, that the presence of a single, unassuming human exchange student had introduced a level of unpredictability that no amount of advanced technology could fully anticipate. The Heliox academic ring prided itself on learning from anomalies rather than suppressing them, and so in the cycle following the corridor incident, the administration responded not with punishment but with observation, subtly adjusting Liam Carter's schedule to place him in closer proximity to situations that, while still within the bounds of safety, carried a higher density of stress variables, all under the justification of providing a well-rounded exchange experience. From Liam's perspective, the change manifested as a slightly heavier academic load and a new requirement to participate in cross-species field simulations designed to test cooperative efficiency, none of which struck him as particularly noteworthy, though he did remark to another student that the ring seemed a bit jumpier than usual, an offhand comment that underscored how differently he interpreted the station's internal mood. The first of these simulations took place in an expansive hollow environment configured to replicate a frontier outpost on a marginally habitable moon, complete with unstable terrain, limited resources, and a rotating set of environmental hazards, intended to force collaboration under controlled pressure. As the mixed species team assembled and received their briefing, Liam listened attentively, nodding along as roles were assigned based on species' specialized strengths, and while his designation placed him in a support capacity rather than a leadership role, he did not object, instead focusing on understanding how the others approached the problem. From the outset, subtle friction emerged as differing cultural assumptions collided, with some participants prioritizing data collection over immediate stability, and others advocating strict adherence to pre-approved plans, even as simulated conditions shifted in ways that rendered those plans increasingly inefficient. Liam moved through the environment with quiet efficiency, carrying equipment, reinforcing temporary structures, and offering suggestions when asked. Yet it was clear to anyone paying attention that he was constantly reassessing the situation, his eyes tracking changes in wind patterns, terrain vibration, and energy output with a focus that went beyond his assigned role. When a simulated dust storm intensified unexpectedly, overwhelming the outpost's external shielding and threatening to compromise the life support systems, several team members hesitated, debating whether to shut down auxiliary modules to preserve power, a decision that carried long-term consequences for mission success. Liam waded through the initial discussion, then pointed out that the storm's particulate density was uneven and that a partial shutdown combined with physical reinforcement on the windward side could buy time without sacrificing critical infrastructure, a solution that required coordinated manual effort rather than purely automated response. The facilitators observed closely as the group implemented the suggestion, noting with interest how quickly Liam transitioned from advisor to active participant, bracing supports, redistributing loads, and adjusting his movements instinctively as the simulated gravity fluctuated, all while maintaining a steady stream of calm, practical communication that kept the others focused. The simulation concluded with a successful stabilization, earning high marks for teamwork. Yet what drew the most attention during the debrief was not the outcome but the behavioral analysis, which showed that Liam's stress indicators remained remarkably low throughout the escalating conditions, even as his physical exertion increased, a combination that defied many species' understanding of effective crisis response. When asked to explain his approach, he shrugged and said that where he came from, unpredictable environments were normal, and that waiting for perfect conditions often made things worse, a statement that prompted a ripple of quiet unease among the facilitators, who had long believed that technological mastery eliminated the need for such adaptability. As word of the simulation's success spread, the narrative surrounding the human exchange student shifted again, no longer framed as an amusing curiosity or a mild concern, but as a subject of genuine interest, with several departments requesting access to his observational data for comparative studies. The oversight AI, processing these requests alongside its growing archive of human-related anomalies, began running deeper simulations, extrapolating potential outcomes of prolonged human presence in high-stress environments. And the results, while still within acceptable margins, displayed a level of variance that warranted caution. That caution intensified later in the cycle, when a casual conversation in the communal dining area sparked an unexpected cultural exchange that would ripple far beyond the room itself, as Liam found himself seated among a group of students discussing planetary hazards, each sharing stories of their species' most dangerous native environments. When it was his turn, he listened politely before offering a few examples from Earth, mentioning venomous creatures, extreme weather, and the simple fact that many of these dangers existed not in remote regions, but in populated areas, encountered as part of daily life rather than exceptional circumstances. The table fell quiet as he spoke, some listeners assuming exaggeration or humor, until he clarified that his home region was known for containing a disproportionate number of the planet's most lethal species, a remark that triggered a flurry of real-time data searches and incredulous reactions. As the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that the human's baseline for what constituted a normal environment differed radically from the galactic average. And when one student asked, half-jokingly, how humans survived at all under such conditions, Liam smiled and replied that you learn to pay attention, respect danger, and get on with things, a philosophy that resonated uncomfortably with the ring's growing body of evidence. By the time the meal concluded and students dispersed, the oversight AI had flagged Earth's hazard index for review, cross-referencing it with Liam's behavior across multiple scenarios, and for the first time, an internal advisory suggested that the ring's existing classification of humans as low-risk participants might be fundamentally flawed, a realization that would soon be tested in ways no simulation could fully prepare them for. By the time the Heliox academic ring entered its next operational cycle, the presence of the human exchange student had ceased to be a quiet anomaly and instead become a factor that certain systems, both organic and artificial, were actively compensating for, not out of hostility but uncertainty. Because while Liam Carter had violated no explicit rules, his behavior consistently revealed gaps in the ring's assumptions about control, safety, and predictability. The shift from curiosity to concern occurred during what was meant to be a routine deep systems maintenance window, a period when non-essential modules were powered down in sequence to allow autonomous drones and oversight. A is to recalibrate structural harmonics affected by the ring's proximity to the gas giant below, a process so reliable that most inhabitants barely noticed it happening. On this cycle, however, a rare convergence of factors, a minor stellar flare, residual stress in the inner lattice from previous fluctuations, and a timing misalignment between two subsystems that had not been updated simultaneously in decades combined, to produce a cascading failure that unfolded faster than automated safeguards could fully suppress. Lights dimmed across multiple sectors. Gravity oscillated sharply enough to send unsecured objects drifting, and emergency bulkheads began sealing in staggered patterns that trapped groups of students and staff in isolated compartments, triggering a spike of fear responses that rippled through the station like static. In the residential wing where Liam happened to be at the time, alarms finally sounded, their tone calibrated to elicit calm compliance rather than panic, instructing occupants to remain where they were and await further instructions. And for several long seconds, everyone did exactly that, standing frozen as conflicting data scrolled across wall displays, each system insisting it held priority. Liam felt the shift in gravity before the alarms finished cycling, his body reacting instinctively as his feet widened and his center of mass lowered. And when the floor lurched again, he reached out to steady a smaller student who had been knocked off balance, guiding them behind a support column without thinking about how the action might be perceived. As the compartment's environmental controls flickered, briefly cutting oxygen flow before restoring it at reduced capacity, fear crept into the room, manifesting as sharp breaths, rapid movements, and a growing sense of helplessness because no clear authority had yet asserted control. Liam glanced at the sealed bulkhead, then at the exposed maintenance access near the ceiling where a panel had loosened under the stress, and in that moment, the instinct shaped by a lifetime of unpredictable environments overrode the training he had been given, compelling him to act rather than wait. He climbed, using handholds not designed for organic use, bracing himself against shifting gravity as he pried open the panel to access a manual override, his movements efficient but careful, aware that one wrong action could make things worse, yet confident enough to proceed without hesitation. Sparks flared as he rerouted power away from the failing environmental regulator, stabilizing the airflow long enough for the room's oxygen levels to normalize. And when another tremor shook the compartment, he shouted clear, simple instructions to those below, telling them where to brace and how to conserve energy, his voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that drew immediate compliance. Elsewhere on the ring, similar scenes played out very differently, with groups waiting for instructions that arrived too late or following protocols that no longer aligned with the rapidly changing situation. And as the oversight, I began compiling real-time data from across the station. A disturbing pattern emerged. In sectors where humans were present, responses were faster, more adaptive, and less dependent on centralized control. The true turning point came when a secondary failure threatened one of the ring's core stabilizers, a massive structure whose disruption could have forced an emergency evacuation of the entire station. And as automated systems struggled to isolate the problem, Liam's actions in the residential wing drew the attention of a nearby emergency response unit, who, upon realizing what he had accomplished, opened a direct communication channel to his location. The exchange was brief and strained, protocol clashing with urgency as they attempted to order him to disengage, only to be met with a calm explanation of what he had already done and what still needed attention, delivered not as a challenge, but as a situational update. Against every instinct and regulation, the officer in charge authorized him to continue assisting under remote supervision, a decision logged as a procedural violation, but justified by the rapidly improving conditions in his sector. For the next several minutes, Liam moved through the compartment and adjacent corridor like someone accustomed to working in unstable environments, sealing leaks, rerouting power, and guiding others to safety with a steady focus that bordered on unsettling, until at last the ring's core systems regained synchronization and the alarms faded into silence. When the crisis ended and the station's artificial gravity settled back into its precise equilibrium, the aftermath was marked not by celebration but stunned quiet, as staff and students alike processed how close the ring had come to a far more serious outcome, and how much of the damage control had been initiated by a single, unauthorized individual. Liam, for his part, sat on the floor near the now secured bulkhead, breathing evenly, hands shaking just enough to betray the adrenaline wearing off, and when medical staff arrived to evaluate him, he waved them off with an apologetic grin, insisting he was fine and asking instead if anyone else needed help. The oversight AI finalized its incident report moments later, and for the first time since the ring's construction, it issued a recommendation not merely for reclassification but for policy revision, stating with cold precision that human behavioral adaptability under crisis conditions represented both a significant asset and a profound risk, depending entirely on whether such individuals were regarded as liabilities to be controlled or partners to be trusted. A conclusion that would force the Heliox academic ring, and eventually the wider galactic community, to confront a truth they had long avoided. Humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or numbers, but its refusal to freeze when everything fell apart. In the cycles that followed the emergency, the Heliox academic ring did not return to normal, so much as it recalibrated its understanding of what normal meant. Because while the structural damage had been repaired and the maintenance logs scrub it of any indication that catastrophe had come uncomfortably close, the psychological aftershocks lingered in every corridor and briefing chamber, especially among those who had witnessed firsthand how quickly their assumptions unraveled. When faced with a human who refused to wait for permission while people were in danger, officially, Liam Carter was summoned before a joint review panel to account for his unauthorized actions, a formality required by station law. Yet the atmosphere in the chamber was markedly different from the disciplinary proceedings most species associated with such summons as the panelists' representatives of science, security, and governance asked not accusatory questions but analytical ones, probing his decision-making process, his assessment of risk, and the source of his confidence in acting without explicit authority. Liam answered honestly, explaining that where he came from, delays often cost more than mistakes, that you learn to act first to stop things getting worse and sort out the rules later, and that waiting for perfect information in a crisis usually meant you were already too late. Statements that were recorded, translated, and replayed countless times in subsequent briefings across the ring. The panel ultimately issued a mild procedural warning, more symbolic than punitive, and then, in a move that would have been unthinkable only days earlier, extended an invitation for Liam to consult informally with emergency response teams during future drills, an acknowledgement that his instincts, while disruptive to protocol, had proven undeniably effective. The cultural impact of that decision spread quickly, reshaping interactions between species in subtle but profound ways. As students who had once dismissed the human as informal or reckless began seeking him out for advice, asking how humans trained for uncertainty, how they managed fear without letting it paralyze them, and whether his actions were the result of specialized training or simply the product of growing up in an environment where danger was a constant, unremarkable companion. Liam answered these questions with the same relaxed candor he'd shown since his arrival, downplaying his role and emphasizing that he wasn't special, that plenty of people back home would have done the same or better, a claim that unsettled the ring's analysts more than any boast could have, because it implied that what they had witnessed was not an exception but a baseline. The oversight AI compiled its final report soon after, updating humanity's classification from a low-risk developing species to a context-dependent variable requiring revised engagement protocols, a diplomatic phrasing that masked a more sobering conclusion buried deep within the data. Humans, particularly those raised in high variability environments, possess the capacity for rapid, adaptive action under stress that challenged the very foundation of centralized control systems the galaxy relied upon. As Liam's exchange term drew to a close, The station hosted a modest farewell gathering, attended by those who had once viewed him with skepticism and now regarded him with a mix of respect and caution. And as he prepared to depart, shouldering his battered travel bag and offering casual goodbyes, several officials quietly expressed hope that future exchanges with humanity could be conducted under clearer expectations and stronger partnerships. Liam smiled at that, promising to pass the message along, and as his transport pulled away from the ring, the oversight AI logged one final note, summarizing the lessons learned not just from the crisis, but from the human who had revealed them, stating that civilizations built to eliminate chaos often forgot how to function when it inevitably returned, while humans, shaped by environments that punished complacency and rewarded adaptability, treated chaos not as an aberration but as a condition to be managed. Long after the ship carrying the Australian exchange student vanished into the dark, the Heliox academic ring continued to operate as it always had, pristine and efficient, yet forever changed by the knowledge that somewhere out there were worlds that produced people who smiled in the face of uncertainty, acted without waiting to be told, and reminded the galaxy, in the most inconvenient way possible, that survival was not always about control, but about the willingness to step forward. When everything else froze,